The night was cold, darker than the pages of history would ever admit. On the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, under a sky that carried no stars of promise, a battered wooden ship groaned as it cut through the black water. The year was 1620, and America, what the world would one day call the United States, was still nothing more than a dangerous idea. The people on board the Mayflower were not heroes. They were hungry, they were afraid, and most of all, they were running. Running from kings who demanded obedience, from churches that demanded silence, from a Europe that had decided who they were allowed to be. Each wave that slammed against the ship felt like a question from God himself. Are you worth saving? No one answered out loud. Below deck, men and women clutched their children as sickness spread through the cramped air. Rats skittered over prayer books, salt water soaked through the planks, the smell of fear mixed with vomit and faith. Many would not survive the journey. Some already hadn't. Yet in that floating coffin, something far more powerful than desperation was being carried across the ocean. An idea. That ordinary people could govern themselves, that belief did not require permission, that a future could be built not by birthright, but by choice. America was not born in triumph, it was conceived in terror. When the ship finally sighted land, the relief was brief. The coast was unfamiliar, wild, and hostile. They had missed their intended destination by hundreds of miles. Winter was coming. Supplies were low. The land did not welcome them, it watched them. Before anyone stepped ashore, something extraordinary happened in the cramped cabin of the ship. 41 men gathered, knowing that once they left the ship, chaos could destroy them. So they did something radical. They wrote an agreement. The Mayflower Compact was not long, not elegant, but it was revolutionary. It declared that power would come from the consent of the governed. No king, no noble blood, just agreement. With shaking hands, they signed it. They had no idea that this fragile document, written in fear and hope, would echo through centuries and become the philosophical ancestor of the United States Constitution. The first winter nearly erased them. By spring, half were dead. Frozen ground held the bodies of mothers, fathers, children. Graves were leveled to hide their numbers from watching native tribes. Survival depended not on strength, but on cooperation and on help from the very people they feared. A man named Squanto changed everything. Captured years earlier, sold into slavery in Europe, he somehow returned to his homeland, speaking English. He taught the settlers how to grow corn, where to fish, how to survive a land that did not forgive ignorance. Without Squanto, there would be no Plymouth. Without Plymouth, the American story would begin very differently. But survival came at a cost. As colonies spread, forests fell, treaties were broken, native nations were pushed aside, then pushed again and again. The American dream was expanding, but it cast a long shadow. By the mid-1700s, 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. They were no longer fragile outposts. They were prosperous, confident, and restless. And they were ruled by a king across the ocean. Taxes increased, representation did not. British soldiers filled colonial streets. What had once been protection now felt like occupation. The question began to whisper from taverns to churches, from docks to farms. Why should we obey a government that does not hear us? Pamphlets spread like wildfire. One of them, written by Thomas Paine, spoke in plain language that common people could understand. Common sense did something dangerous. It made rebellion sound reasonable. By 1775, reason turned into gunfire. At Lexington and Concord, farmers picked up muskets against the most powerful army in the world. No one was supposed to win that fight.
Yet they fired anyway. The American Revolution was not clean or glorious. It was cold, chaotic, and uncertain. Soldiers lacked shoes, officers lacked training, desertion was common, victory seemed impossible. And yet, in frozen camps like Valley Forge, something hardened. Not just an army, but an identity. George Washington was not a perfect man. He made mistakes, he lost battles, but he understood something rare. Power must be restrained, or it becomes tyranny. When the independence was finally declared in 1776, the words were dangerous. Signing the Declaration of Independence was an act of treason punishable by death. They signed anyway. The war dragged on, families were torn apart, loyalists fled, cities burned. Foreign powers watched, waiting to see if this experiment would collapse. Against all odds, it didn't. In 1783, Britain surrendered. 13 colonies became a nation. But freedom did not mean unity. The new country was fragile, divided, and deeply flawed. Slavery remained. Women had no voice. Native Americans were excluded entirely. The promise of liberty was real, but unevenly applied. The Constitution was written not as a declaration of perfection, but as a framework for correction. We the people did not yet include everyone, but it left the door open. That door would be forced wider by war, by blood, by protest, and by generations who refused to accept that freedom belonged only to a few. America was no longer a dream, it was a question. And the centuries ahead would test whether it deserved the answer it claimed to be.
America won its independence, but it did not win its innocence. As fireworks faded and treaties were signed, the new nation stood at a crossroads, carrying two truths that could not peacefully coexist. One was spoken loudly, written boldly, and celebrated publicly. All men are created equal. The other lived quietly in fields, kitchens, auction blocks, and darkened ships. Millions were enslaved. The contradiction was not accidental. It was deliberate. In the southern states, vast plantations stretched across fertile land, producing tobacco, rice, sugar, and cotton, commodities that fueled global trade. This wealth rested entirely on the backs of enslaved Africans, men and women stripped of names, families, and futures. They were property under the law of a nation founded on liberty. In the North, slavery slowly faded, replaced by wage labor and growing industry. Factories arose, cities expanded, banks flourished. And though many Northerners spoke against slavery, their economy was still deeply entangled with it. Cotton picked by enslaved hands fed Northern mills. Profits flowed everywhere. The nation pretended it could look away. The Constitution itself was a compromise with injustice. It avoided the word slavery, yet protected it. The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved people as fractions, enough to increase political power for slave states, but never enough to grant humanity. The Fugitive Slave Clause demanded the return of escapees to bondage, even in free states. America had chosen unity over morality. But contradictions do not remain silent forever. As the country expanded westward, the question followed like a shadow. Would new states be free or slave? Each new territory reopened old wounds. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and later the Kansas-Nebraska Act were attempts to delay the inevitable. They did not solve the problem, they sharpened it. Violence erupted in places like Bleeding, Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought with rifles and knives over the future of a land not yet a state. Politics turned deadly. Congress itself was not immune.
One senator was beaten nearly to death on the Senate floor for opposing slavery. Words were no longer enough. Meanwhile, enslaved people resisted in every way they could. Some slowed their labor. Some preserved their cultures through song and story. Some ran. The Underground Railroad was neither underground nor a railroad, but a network of courage. Ordinary people, black and white, risked everything to guide fugitives north. One woman, Harriet Tubman, returned again and again into slave territory, leading dozens to freedom. Slave catchers hunted her relentlessly. They never caught her. She was called Moses. Others resisted openly. In 1831, Nat Turner led a rebellion that terrified the South. The revolt was crushed, but the message was unmistakable. Slavery was not accepted quietly. Fear tightened its grip. Laws grew harsher. Education for enslaved people was banned. Cruelty increased, not decreased. The nation was moving toward something catastrophic. In 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln shattered the fragile balance. Lincoln did not promise to end slavery immediately, but he opposed its expansion. For the South, that was enough. One by one, states declared secession. They formed the Confederate States of America, convinced they were defending their way of life. They were defending slavery. War came not with ceremony, but with cannon fire at Fort Sumter in 1861. What followed was the bloodiest conflict in American history. Brother fought brother. Entire towns disappeared. Fields turned into graveyards. The Civil War was not just a military struggle, it was a moral reckoning. At first, Lincoln fought to preserve the Union, not to free the enslaved. But war has a way of clarifying purpose. As enslaved people fled to Union lines by the thousands, the meaning of the conflict changed. They forced the issue with their feet. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all enslaved people immediately, but it transformed the war. Freedom became a goal. Enslaved men joined the Union Army. They fought bravely for a nation that had never fought for them. By the time the war ended in 1865, over 600,000 were dead. Slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. The 14th promised citizenship. The 15th promised voting rights to black men. On paper, the contradictions seemed resolved. In reality, it had only changed shape. The South lay in ruins. The economy collapsed. Millions were free, but free into poverty, hostility, and violence. Reconstruction promised a new beginning. Black Americans voted, held office, built schools and communities. For a brief moment, democracy expanded. Then came the backlash. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black citizens. Laws known as Black Codes and later Jim Crow enforced segregation and disenfranchisement. Federal troops withdrew. Reconstruction ended not with victory, but exhaustion. Freedom survived. Equality did not. The nation moved forward, but unevenly. Railroads stitched the continent together. The West was won, often at the cost of Native American lives and cultures. Treaties were broken as routinely as they were signed. Entire nations were forced onto reservations, starved or killed. The country grew powerful, wealthy, and confident. But beneath the progress, the old question still lingered. Who is America really for? That question would not fade. It would return in factories and strikes, in marches and movements, in courts and classrooms, and eventually in streets filled with voices refusing to be ignored. The nation had survived its birth. It had survived its Civil War. The next test would come not from cannons, but from the people themselves, demanding that the promise finally match the words. When the guns fell silent after the Civil War,
America did not rest. It accelerated. The nation turned its grief into motion, its ruins into railroads, its dead into determination. What followed was not an age of healing, but an age of iron, smoke, and speed. The United States began transforming itself from a fractured agrarian republic into an industrial giant, and the change was ruthless. Railroad tracks spread like veins across the continent, binding distant lands into a single economic body. Steel bridges crossed rivers that once marked the edge of civilization. Cities exploded upward and outward, swallowing farmland and sky alike. The promise was prosperity. The cost was human. Factories roared day and night. Inside them, men, women, and children worked brutal hours for wages that barely kept hunger away. Safety was optional. Injury was common. Death was an accepted expense. The machines did not slow for screams. Immigrants arrived by the millions. They came from Ireland, fleeing famine, from Germany, escaping failed revolutions, from Italy and Eastern Europe, running from poverty and persecution. Later came Chinese laborers, Japanese farmers, and others drawn by rumors of opportunity. They stepped onto American soil carrying nothing but hope, and were greeted with suspicion, exploitation, and hostility. Ellis Island processed dreams with bureaucratic efficiency. Names were shortened, identities were reshaped. The message was clear: you may belong here, but only on our terms. Ethnic neighborhoods formed, Little Italies, Chinatowns, Jewish quarters, places of culture and survival in a country that often refused to see newcomers as fully American. Newspapers warned of foreign threats, politicians stoked fear, laws were passed to exclude, restrict, and control. Yet these same immigrants built the nation. They laid tracks through mountains, they dug tunnels beneath cities, they filled factories and sweatshops, they cleaned homes, cooked meals, and stitched garments that clothed a growing population. America depended on them and resented them for it. At the top of this new economic order stood men of immense power: Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, industrialists who reshaped entire industries. They were hailed as captains of industry and condemned as robber barons. Their wealth was unimaginable. Their influence reached into politics, courts, and daily life. Competition was crushed. Monopolies grew. The market no longer felt free. It felt controlled. Below them, workers organized. Strikes erupted across the country. At Homestead, steel workers fought private armies. At Pullman, railway workers shut down transportation nationwide. Federal troops were sent, not to protect labor, but to restore order and protect business interests. Blood was spilled for the 8-hour workday. Lives were lost for the right to organize. Slowly, painfully, reforms emerged: child labor laws, workplace safety standards, antitrust legislation. These victories were not gifts, they were concessions wrung from conflict. Meanwhile, the American frontier officially closed. The West, once imagined as endless, had been claimed, fenced, and divided. Native American resistance was crushed through military force and broken treaties. The Battle of Wounded Knee marked not just a massacre, but the symbolic end of armed Native resistance. Children were sent to boarding schools designed to erase language, culture, and identity. The land was American now. Its original peoples were expected to disappear. As the 20th century approached, the United States looked outward. The Spanish-American War in 1898 marked a turning point. America emerged with overseas territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and a new sense of itself as a global power. The nation that once resisted empire now practiced it. At home, reformers pushed back against corruption and inequality. The Progressive Era brought new ideas: regulation, conservation, public education, women's suffrage. Journalists exposed abuses. Activists demanded accountability. President Theodore Roosevelt challenged corporate excess and promoted a stronger federal government. In 1920, women finally won the right to vote. It had taken more than a century. Then came the illusion of endless prosperity. The roaring 20s glittered with jazz, automobiles, movies, and stock market speculation. Consumer culture exploded. Credit flowed freely. The future seemed unstoppable. Underneath, the foundation was fragile. In 1929, it collapsed. The Great Depression was swift and merciless. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment soared, bread lines stretched for blocks, farmers lost land to dust and debt. The American dream became survival. Faith in the system shattered. In response, the government transformed itself. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt launched the New Deal, expanding federal power to provide relief, recovery, and reform. Social Security was born, labor rights strengthened, infrastructure projects put millions to work. Not everyone agreed. Critics warned of socialism. Others argued it didn't go far enough. But the relationship between Americans and their government was permanently altered. Then the world caught fire. War in Europe and Asia eventually pulled the United States into World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. The nation mobilized with staggering force. Factories became arsenals. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The economy surged. But fear again revealed America's flaws. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated to internment camps, citizens imprisoned without charges based solely on ancestry. The Constitution bent under panic. The war ended with victory and with horror. Atomic bombs leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States emerged as a superpower, carrying both triumph and responsibility. The world had changed, so had America. Prosperity returned, suburbs spread, the middle class expanded, but the benefits were not evenly shared. Segregation remained, inequality persisted. Underneath the calm surface, pressure built. The question resurfaced once more. Who is included in the American promise and who is not? The next generation would no longer accept silence as an answer.
The war had ended, but America was still fighting itself. Victory in World War II crowned the United States as a global superpower. Its factories were unmatched, its military dominant, its confidence immense. Yet at home, millions lived under laws that treated them as second-class citizens. The contradiction returned again, sharper than before. Black veterans came home wearing uniforms earned in battle, only to be denied service at restaurants, refused housing, and blocked from voting. They had fought for freedom abroad and were told to wait for it at home. They would not wait. In the South, segregation ruled daily life. Separate schools, separate buses, separate water fountains. Separate but equal was the lie that sustained it. Violence enforced the system. Silence protected it. Then the silence broke. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional. It was a legal earthquake. Southern states resisted fiercely. Some closed schools entirely rather than integrate. Federal authority clashed with local defiance. A year later, a tired seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her quiet act of defiance ignited a movement. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted over a year.
It was led by a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr., whose words carried both moral clarity and strategic purpose. Nonviolence became a weapon. Sit-ins, marches, boycotts, ordinary people confronting injustice with extraordinary discipline. They faced dogs, fire hoses, jail cells, and bombs. Children marched, churches burned, cameras captured everything. America watched itself on television. The images could not be ignored. In 1963, King stood before the Lincoln Memorial and spoke words that would echo across history. "I have a dream." The dream was not abstract, it was specific, demanding that the nation honor its own promises. The cost was high. Civil rights workers were beaten, murdered, and disappeared. In Mississippi, Alabama, and elsewhere, activists risked and often lost their lives. Federal intervention became unavoidable. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act outlawed segregation. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act dismantled barriers to the ballot. These laws reshaped the legal landscape of the nation. But laws do not change hearts overnight. As progress advanced, backlash intensified. Urban unrest exploded in cities where poverty and police brutality persisted. New voices emerged, some rejecting nonviolence, demanding power rather than permission. The movement diversified, fractured, evolved. Then America lost its leaders. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Malcolm X in 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, Robert Kennedy weeks later. The nation mourned and questioned itself. At the same time, fear shaped foreign policy. The Cold War pitted the United States against the Soviet Union in a global struggle of ideology. Nuclear weapons promised mutual destruction. School children practiced duck and cover drills. Suspicion infected politics. The Red Scare destroyed careers and lives. Accusations replaced evidence. Dissent was equated with disloyalty. Fear became a governing tool. Nowhere did these tensions erupt more violently than in Vietnam. What began as a distant conflict escalated into a prolonged, controversial war. Young Americans were drafted to fight in jungles many could not find on a map. Televised images showed body bags, burning villages, and grieving families. Trust in government eroded. College campuses became battlegrounds of protest. Music, art, and culture reflected rebellion and disillusionment. The counterculture rejected traditional authority, questioned war, and demanded personal freedom. In 1973, American forces withdrew from Vietnam. 2 years later, Saigon fell. The war ended not with victory, but with exhaustion and doubt. Then came Watergate. In 1974, President Richard Nixon resigned after a scandal revealed abuse of power at the highest level. For the first time, Americans watched their political system hold a president accountable. Faith was shaken, but the Constitution endured. The decades that followed brought rapid change. The women's movement challenged gender inequality. LGBTQ+ activists demanded recognition and rights. Environmental disasters spurred new awareness and regulation. Technology began to reshape work, communication, and identity. America entered the late 20th century more diverse, more open, and more divided. The Cold War finally ended in 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. The United States stood alone as the world's dominant power. Many believed history had reached a peaceful conclusion. They were wrong. On a clear September morning in 2001, the illusion of security vanished. Terrorist attacks killed thousands and reshaped global politics. Fear returned. Wars followed. Surveillance expanded. Questions of liberty versus safety dominated national debate. America moved forward, carrying old wounds and new ones. The struggle was never about a single moment or movement. It was about a nation constantly redefining itself, sometimes expanding freedom, sometimes restricting it, always arguing over its meaning. The story was not finished. It never would be, because America was not a destination. It was a process.
The 21st century did not arrive quietly. It came at full speed, wired, watched, and wounded. After September 11, 2001, America woke each morning with a new awareness of vulnerability. Airports became fortresses. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq stretched on longer than promised. Young soldiers returned changed, or not at all. Trillions were spent. Answers were harder to find than enemies. At home, fear reshaped law. Surveillance expanded. Privacy narrowed. The balance between security and freedom tilted, then tilted again. Some accepted it as necessary. Others warned that liberty, once surrendered, rarely returns untouched. Technology accelerated everything. The internet rewired communication. Social media collapsed distance and erased filters. News became instant, emotional, and endless. Truth competed with outrage. Algorithms learned what people feared and fed them more of it. America was more connected than ever, and more divided. In 2008, a financial crisis exposed deep structural flaws. Banks collapsed, homes were foreclosed, millions lost jobs and savings. The system was rescued, but many people were not. Anger simmered beneath the recovery. That same year, history turned a page. Barack Obama was elected the first black president of the United States. For some, it was proof of progress long promised. For others, it was unsettling, even threatening. The symbolism was powerful. The resistance was just as real. Racial tensions never disappeared, they adapted. Police killings of unarmed black Americans reignited centuries-old grievances. Smartphones captured what had once gone unseen. Protests filled streets. Movements like Black Lives Matter demanded accountability and recognition. Supporters called it justice. Critics called it disorder. The argument was not new. The visibility was. Economic inequality widened. The middle class shrank. Automation replaced jobs. Education costs soared. Healthcare remained contested. For many, the American dream felt increasingly distant. Politics hardened into identity. Compromise became betrayal. Disagreement became enemy. Elections felt existential. Trust in institutions, media, government, science, fractured along cultural lines. Every issue became a battlefield. Then came the pandemic. In 2020, COVID-19 shut down the world. Hospitals overflowed. Millions died globally. In America, the crisis exposed disparities. Who could work safely, who could not? Who had access to care, who did not? Masks, vaccines, and public health became political symbols. Isolation deepened division. That same year, protests erupted after the killing of George Floyd. Streets filled again. Some marches were peaceful, others burned. The nation argued about history, policing, monuments, and memory itself. What should be remembered? What should be removed? Who decides? The election that followed was among the most contentious in U.S. history. Claims of fraud, court battles, and rhetoric pushed faith in democracy to its limits. On January 6, 2021, the U.S. Capitol, symbol of representative government, was breached by Americans themselves. The image shocked the world. It was not the end of democracy, it was a warning. Through all of it, life continued. People loved, worked, created, and hoped. Immigrants still arrived seeking opportunity.
Activists still organized, scientists still innovated, artists still told stories, teachers still showed up. America did not collapse, but it did not resolve itself either. The United States had never been a finished product. From the Mayflower to the modern megacity, from chains to citizenship, from exclusion to expansion, its history moved not in a straight line, but in struggle. Every generation inherited the same question, rephrased for its time. Who belongs? Who decides? And how much freedom can survive fear? The answer was never permanent. That was the secret and the burden of the American experiment. It was not guaranteed by documents alone. It was sustained by participation, corrected by protest, preserved by restraint, and renewed by those unwilling to accept injustice as tradition. America was born from an idea powerful enough to cross an ocean. That idea had been tested by slavery, war, greed, fear, and division. It had bent, it had nearly broken, but it endured, not because it was perfect, but because it allowed itself to be challenged. The story did not end here. It continued every time a citizen voted, spoke, resisted, or rebuilt. Every time the country faced its past instead of burying it. Every time the promise was demanded, not begged for. The United States was never just a place on a map. It was an argument about power, about dignity, about whether a diverse people could govern themselves without destroying one another. That argument was still alive, and the future, as always, would be written not by destiny, but by choice.